Imagine you are living in a beautiful historic home, say, a 1920s Craftsman.
Oh, those are gorgeous. The architecture is amazing.
Right. It's got those gorgeous original double-hung wooden windows. But I want you to think about what happens every time you slide one of those windows open to let in a breeze.
Yeah, that's where the problem starts.
Exactly. Because you have wood sliding against wood, paint grinding against paint. What you are actually doing, without realizing it, is operating a giant cheese grater.
It is a chilling image, truly.
It is. Because the friction is slowly shaving microscopic dust off that historic window frame. And that dust is just drifting down, settling invisibly onto the floor right where, say, your toddler is playing.
That dust isn't just old paint. I mean, it's an invisible, potent neurotoxin that doesn't just disappear.
And that is exactly the reality for millions of people right now. Today, we are taking a deep dive into a hazard that feels like it belongs in the history books, but is actually hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, it's the ultimate hidden enemy.
If you are living in, or even just visiting, an older home, this deep dive is absolutely for you. We are talking about lead paint.
You can't see it, you can't smell it, the walls look perfectly normal while they are, slowly causing permanent harm.
Right. So to figure out what we are actually up against, we have an incredible stack of sources today.
We really do, some very dense stuff.
Oh, definitely. We're pulling from macro public health data from America's Health Rankings and the Texas Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program, which we'll just call the Texas CLPPP to keep things simple.
Good call.
But we're also going microscopic. We have a highly detailed OSHA worker safety manual on lead abatement, plus the actual technical specs for a piece of cutting-edge detection equipment called the SciAps X550 XRF Analyzer.
Which is an amazing piece of technology, by the way.
It really is. So our mission today is to figure out why lead is still such a persistent threat decades after it was banned, how experts are using literal sci-fi tech to hunt it down, and the surprisingly intense, heavily regulated science of destroying it safely.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we talk about the hazmat suits and the scanners, we really need to understand the biology. Why are we so terrified of old paint?
Well, it essentially comes down to a case of biological mistaken identity.
Mistaken identity. How so?
So lead is a naturally occurring heavy metal, right? But
Yeah.
the human body has absolutely no use for it whatsoever. And the most critical fact from all our public health sources is this: there is no known safe level of lead exposure.
Zero.
Exactly zero. In fact, the CDC recently lowered their threshold for identifying unsafe blood lead levels to just 3.5 micrograms per deciliter.
Wow, that is incredibly low. So what does this actually mean for the body? When you say mistaken identity, what is the lead doing once it gets inside us?
Well, think about how a developing body builds itself. Children under the age of 6 are at the absolute highest risk because, their brains and nervous systems are actively constructing billions of neural connections.
Right, they're growing so fast.
Exactly. And to build those connections, the brain relies heavily on calcium. Calcium acts as a messenger. It helps the neurons fire and communicate.
Okay, I'm following.
The problem is, on a molecular level, a lead ion looks incredibly similar to a calcium ion.
Oh, wow. So the brain just accidentally welcomes it in.
Precisely. The body absorbs the lead dust, usually from a child putting their hands or a dusty toy in their mouth. It enters the bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and the brain basically says, great, more calcium.
And tries to use it to build a synapse. That is terrifying.
It really is, because lead doesn't work like calcium. Instead of helping the neuron fire, it actually disrupts the signal and damages the cell.
Ah, so it breaks the connection.
Yeah. This is why the Texas public health data emphasizes that even at very low levels, the cognitive impacts are permanent. It physically alters brain architecture.
Meaning you can't just fix it later.
Right. It affects intellectual function, attention span, and academic skills well into adulthood.
That is deeply unsettling. And for pregnant individuals, the sources mention it's just as dangerous, right?
Yes, because that same mechanism allows high blood lead levels to be passed directly to the developing fetus, which can potentially cause miscarriages, low birth weight, or preterm births.
Because the body is hoarding it.
Yeah, the body actually stores lead in the bones right alongside real calcium, so it can be released back into the bloodstream years later during pregnancy.
Wow. Knowing how severe the biological impact is, you would honestly think the risk is everywhere. But the geography of where this threat actually lives today is wild.
It's very unevenly distributed.
It is. Looking at the data from America's Health Rankings, I kind of expected the hazard to be pretty evenly spread across the country. But take a state like Texas. They actually rank 5th best in the U.S.
Yeah, only 8.0% of their housing stock has a potential elevated lead risk.
Right. What's fascinating here is how clearly the public health data is a mirror of American urban expansion.
Exactly. The risk is entirely dictated by the age of the walls around you. Lead-based paint was banned for residential use back in 1978.
So anything built after that is mostly fine.
Generally, yes. But housing built before 1978 carries elevated risk. And anything built before 1950 poses the absolute highest risk.
Why pre-1950 specifically?
Because the paint from that era was loaded with heavy concentrations of lead. I mean, they used it for durability, for color, it was everywhere.
Which perfectly explains the massive disparity between states. Like, Texas is at 8%, and Nevada is the best in the country at just 4.5%.
But then you look at the Northeast.
Right, look at New York. New York is sitting at the very bottom, where 31.7% of the housing stock has an elevated lead risk. That's almost a third of all homes.
Because the Northeast and the Midwest have an incredibly old housing stock. I mean, they were established and heavily populated long before the mid-century housing booms that kind of defined the South and the West.
So if you live in New York, Massachusetts, or Pennsylvania, you're just surrounded by pre-1950s architecture.
Disproportionately so, yes.
I want to go back to that cheese grater analogy for a second. If I'm living in a pre-1978 house, is the paint dangerous just sitting there? Like, if it's painted over and looks fine, am I safe?
You are safe as long as the surface remains perfectly intact. The key concept in the Texas CLPPP data is deterioration.
So intact means trapped.
Exactly. If the paint is in perfect condition, the lead is trapped. But the moment it peels, chips, or flakes...
Or you open that old window.
Right. The moment you introduce friction from a door frame rubbing, a window sliding, or even just a stair tread being walked on, you are generating that toxic dust.
So friction is the trigger, which honestly leads to a massive logistical problem. If I'm a public health official or just, a home buyer, I can't just look at a wall and see if it's going to poison someone.
No, it's completely invisible.
And I certainly don't want to start scraping off samples and creating the very dust I'm trying to avoid in the first place.
Which brings us to the tech.
Yes. I saw the specs in our stack for this detection device, this IEPS X550. I mean, it basically looks like a high-end, futuristic barcode scanner with a touchscreen, kind of like a Star Trek tricorder. How does this thing actually see through walls?
It uses a technology called X-Ray Fluorescence, or XRF, and it is a total game changer. The X550 is an EPA and HUD-approved handheld device that literally shoots X-rays into a wall.
Okay, I have to know how that works. What is fluorescence in this context? Are the heavy metals, like glowing in the dark, inside the drywall?
It's a great question, and it's purely atomic physics. When the device fires a low-power X-ray into the paint, it acts like a cue ball breaking a rack of billiard balls.
Okay, a microscopic cue ball. I like that.
Right. It smashes into an atom of lead and knocks one of the atom's inner electrons completely out of orbit.
Oh, well, just ejects it entirely.
Yes. Now, nature hates a vacuum, right? So an outer electron immediately drops down to fill that empty space.
And that energy difference has to go somewhere.
Precisely. When that outer electron drops down, it releases a burst of energy in the form of a photon. That photon is the fluorescence.
Okay, that makes sense.
And here's the magic part. Every element on the periodic table releases a photon with a completely unique energy signature. The X550's pulse processor catches that photon and reads its signature.
So it knows exactly what lead looks like.
Even through multiple layers of modern paint.
That is incredible. And the specs say it gives a precise reading in just 2 to 6 seconds.
It's incredibly fast.
But reading through the documents, the really big deal seems to be what this scanner does not have. The manual mentions that older XRF analyzers used radioactive isotopes.
They did. To generate the X-rays, older machines relied on a small piece of decaying radioactive material.
That sounds intense.
It was. It meant if you were a home inspector, you were carrying a radioactive source in your trunk. It required intense licensing, specific travel restrictions, and eventually...
But don't tell me disposal fees.
Massive disposal fees. When the isotope decayed to a certain point, you had to pay an absolute fortune to send it to a specialized nuclear waste facility.
Just to test someone's living room. But the SciAps device bypasses all of that.
Entirely. It uses a miniature 5-watt X-ray tube instead. No isotopes, no radioactive decay, no massive disposal fees.
So it's just an electronic X-ray.
Exactly. You turn it on, it creates the X-ray electronically, and when you turn it off, it's completely inert.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, The speed and safety of that technology must revolutionize how we handle public health.
It really does. It completely removes the barrier of time. In its OSHA application mode, the X550 detects lead down to zero point 0.01 milligrams per square centimeter.
That's tiny.
It is. A health inspector can walk into a suspected daycare facility, point this device at the baseboards and windowsills, and know instantly, with 95% confidence, if the environment is contaminated.
So no more waiting weeks for a lab to process paint chips.
Right, while children are continuing to play on that very floor. It's immediate.
Okay, so let's say the scanner beeps. The screen lights up red. You have a massive lead hazard in a home. What happens next? I know from the OSHA manual that this is where things get incredibly intense.
Very intense.
HUD defines the solution, which they call abatement, as a permanent fix that must last at least 20 years.
Yes. Abatement isn't just a quick coat of paint to hide the problem. It is a highly regulated, highly dangerous industrial process. The OSHA manual outlines a strict hierarchy of methods, and honestly, none of them are easy.
Okay, let's start with the most aggressive option, replacement. This is where you just admit defeat and rip the offending piece of the house completely out.
It is the most permanent solution. You physically pry the old wooden window frame or the door out of the wall and install a modern non-lead part. The hazard is gone forever.
But the catch is the collateral damage, right?
Exactly. Ripping out building materials creates a toxic dust storm.
The manual details how workers have to constantly wet mist the entire demolition area with water just to keep the dust heavy so it falls to the ground.
Yeah, and they have to run specialized HEPA vacuums, that's high-efficiency particulate air vacuums, just to scrub the ambient air.
And then the disposal. They have to wrap the old contaminated wood in heavy-duty polyplastic and seal it with duct tape just to carry it to the truck.
It is a massive containment operation, but, sometimes you just can't rip out the material. Maybe it's a structural wall, or maybe the cost is just way too high.
Which brings us to the second method, enclosure.
Right. If you can't remove the hazard, you bury it behind a solid, dust-tight barrier. Think of putting up a brand new layer of drywall directly over an old plaster wall.
I notice a really specific, almost cinematic rule in the manual about enclosure. Before you trap the old wall behind the new drywall, the workers are required to physically label the hidden surface.
Yes, they are.
They have to take spray paint and literally write lead-based paint on the old plaster. Why go to all that trouble if you're just going to bury it?
Because an enclosure doesn't neutralize the threat, it just delays it. Imagine a plumber comes into that house 15 years later to fix a pipe.
Oh, and they just cut into the wall.
Right. They take a reciprocating saw and cut a square hole in the drywall. If that warning isn't there, they're going to slice right into the original lead paint and blast that invisible neurotoxin straight into their lungs.
Ah, so the label is a warning to the future.
Exactly. And the manual is ruthless about the materials used for this. Wallpaper or contact paper do not count.
They aren't thick enough.
No. An enclosure must be rigid, durable, and mechanically sealed with caulk to be completely dust-tight.
But let's say I don't want to lose the square footage by building a false wall. Why can't I just go to the hardware store, buy a really thick, heavy bucket of primer, and trap the lid that way? The manual mentions encapsulation. Isn't that just painting over it?
It is a really common misconception, but absolutely not. Regular interior paint is relatively thin and honestly quite brittle. It will eventually crack and peel, releasing the lead right back out.
So what makes an encapsulant different?
Encapsulants are highly engineered, incredibly thick liquid coatings. They're often made of elastomeric polymers.
Meaning they stretch.
Yes, they act more like a durable, flexible rubber than normal paint. They bond intensely to the surface and have the tensile strength to stretch and move as the house shifts with temperature changes, all without cracking.
But the manual stresses that even with these high-tech polymers, you have to perform a strict test patch first. You can't just coat the whole room right away.
Because you have to prove the foundation is solid. An encapsulant is only as strong as the old paint underneath it.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, if the old lead paint is already separating from the wood, or if there's, say, a hidden moisture leak in the wall, the thick new polymer will just pull the old paint right off the wall under its own weight.
Because it's so heavy.
Right. It will bubble, crack, and fail. And then you just have chunks of expensive rubberized lead falling onto your living room floor.
Which brings us to the absolute last resort in the manual. Paint removal. This is where you keep the original wood or metal, but you strip the lead paint entirely off. And this just sounds like an absolute nightmare.
It's definitely the most hazardous method by far. You are directly confronting the material. You're using chemical strippers, these caustic pastes that literally dissolve the paint.
And the workers are in full gear for this.
Oh yeah. Workers have to wear chemical-resistant hazmat suits. And once the paint melts off, you have to neutralize the entire surface using pH indicators. Otherwise, the chemicals will just eat through whatever new paint you try to apply later.
And the runoff from that process.
It's highly hazardous liquid waste. It has to be captured, contained, and disposed of according to very strict environmental regulations.
Wow. Okay, so if I'm a contractor and I'm staring down the barrel of toxic chemical pastes and hazmat suits, human nature is naturally going to look for a shortcut.
Always.
Right. Like, why can't I just take a high-powered electric sander and grind the paint off? Or better yet, take a blowtorch and just burn it off.
Because taking those shortcuts will literally poison you and everyone in the vicinity. The OSHA manual has strict prohibitions that are basically written in blood.
No exceptions.
None. There is absolutely no dry scraping allowed, no machine sanding without a specialized HEPA vacuum attached directly to the tool, no torching whatsoever. And you absolutely cannot use a heat gun that operates over 1100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Why that specific number? Why is 1100 degrees the absolute limit?
It comes down to how the human body filters air. Normally, if you breathe in a piece of regular dust, the mucus and cilia in your nose and throat catch it. But at 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, lead doesn't just melt, it vaporizes.
Oh, wow. It becomes a gas.
It transitions from a solid directly into a toxic fume. The particles become so infinitesimally tiny that they completely bypass your body's natural respiratory defenses.
So they just go straight in.
They travel deep into the microscopic alveoli of your lungs and cross instantly into your bloodstream. By using a blowtorch, you are taking a localized surface hazard and turning it into a lethal breathable gas.
The manual actually includes a training skit to drive this point home, right? Feels like they really know the psychology of contractors on a job site.
Yes. The skit features two workers, Ed and Abdul. Ed is trying to save time on a job. He decides to dry scrape some trim, and he tells Abdul, "Just clean up underneath me as I go. You're wearing a respirator. It's fine."
Which sounds completely logical if you don't understand the microscopic physics of what's happening.
Exactly. And Abdul has to stop him and explain that a standard respirator is not magic. If you dry scrape, you are generating an invisible cloud of neurotoxins. It just hangs in the air.
And then it settles everywhere.
Right. It settles on the countertops. It gets embedded in the weave of your clothing so you take it home to your own kids. The skit is in the manual because, well, human nature demands speed. But with lead abatement, speed is usually toxic.
So we've talked a lot about the industrial side, the hazmat suits, the chemical strippers.
Yeah.
But how does this translate to the everyday listener? What if you were just a homeowner who wants to do a weekend DIY renovation in a house built in, say, 1960?
It translates directly to you because the public health data shows that everyday renovations are actually a massive driver of modern lead poisoning.
Really? Just weekend projects?
Yes. The Texas SEAL PPP specifically highlights that interior remodeling, things like sanding old door frames, scraping a peeling wall, or knocking down plaster to open up a kitchen, are huge risk factors.
The warnings from Texas are intense. They actually advise that if you are doing significant renovations in a pre-1978 home, you need to relocate your family completely until the project is done and the dust is cleared.
It's the only way to be totally safe.
Or better yet, don't do it yourself at all. Hire an EPA-certified renovator.
It is absolutely worth the money. Certified professionals know how to build those negative pressure polyplastic barriers. They know how to perform the wet misting techniques that keep the microscopic dust out of your family's lungs.
But what if you aren't knocking down walls? What if you just rent an apartment in an older building with original painted windows? Our sources have some very practical advice for just, coexisting with the risk.
Yeah, the primary strategy there is dust management. You should clean your home at least once a week using a wet washing method.
So no sweeping?
Right, don't use a dry broom. Sweeping just kicks the invisible heavy metals right up into your breathing zone. You want to use soap and water to wipe down windowsills, baseboards, and floors.
And the vacuuming rule is critical here. You mentioned HEPA vacuums earlier for the industrial sites, but it applies to the living room too.
It definitely does.
If you use a standard vacuum cleaner on lead dust, the filter just isn't fine enough. You will literally suck up the neurotoxins from the floor and blast them out the exhaust vent, atomizing them perfectly into the air you are breathing.
Exactly. You are taking a hazard that was lying on the floor and weaponizing it into the air.
That is such a scary visual.
It is. Only use a vacuum with a certified HEPA filter. And on a personal level, make sure kids wash their hands frequently, especially before they eat. Wash their toys regularly because, toddlers experience the world by crawling on the floor and putting things in their mouths.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you listen to all of this, the specialized X-ray scanners, the HEPA vacuums, the elastomeric encapsulants, the hazemat suits, it sounds astronomically expensive. You would think society can't afford to fix this.
It does sound like a huge financial burden.
But the macro data shows the exact opposite. Investing in lead paint hazard control in high-risk communities returns anywhere from $17 to $221 in societal and health costs for every single dollar spent.
This raises an important question about how we value public health. On one hand, maintaining older, historic, often more affordable housing is a necessity.
We can't just tear it all down.
Right. But on the other hand, protecting vulnerable populations from an invisible brain toxin is a moral imperative. That staggering economic return, up to 221 to 1, exists because the cost of a child losing their cognitive potential is just astronomical.
It affects their whole life.
It does.
Right.
We pay for lead poisoning through decades of special education requirements, specialized healthcare, lost adult productivity, and even the criminal justice system.
So spending $1 to safely strip a window frame isn't just a construction cost. It is literally an investment in preserving the brain architecture of the next generation.
Precisely. And prevention is the only true cure here. Once lead is absorbed and the neural pathways are damaged, it cannot be reversed.
So to bring this all together for you listening, if you live in or are planning to remodel a pre-1978 home, consider this deep dive your blueprint. Lead paint is a permanent, serious health hazard, but it is not a death sentence for your home.
Not at all.
With simple wet cleaning methods, high-tech XRF testing to know exactly where the threat is, and proper HEPA filtered abatement, it is an entirely preventable danger.
It just requires respect for the science. Understand the rules, don't take the fast route like Ed in the OSHA skit, and manage the environment deliberately.
We banned lead paint back in 1978, but the ghost of that decision is still haunting millions of homes today, requiring sci-fi scanners and extreme chemistry to safely remove. So I want to leave you with a thought. Look around the room you are sitting in right now. What everyday, perfectly legal, incredibly common building materials or chemicals are we completely surrounded by today that 50 years from now will require a hazmat suit and a high-tech scanner to safely remove?
It certainly makes you wonder what our blind spots are right now.
It really does. Stay curious.